A homeless black boy saves a racist woman from certain death. You'd think such an act of bravery would change her heart, right? But what happens next reveals a shocking truth about racism, forgiveness, and the human soul. The final twist will stay with you forever. It was one of those crisp autumn mornings that carried a chill biting enough to rattle bones. For Claire Montgomery, a middle-aged woman known around her small southern town for her sharp tongue and sharper opinions, it was just another ordinary day. She clutched her handbag tightly as she strode down the city sidewalk, her polished heels clicking against the cobblestones. Her breath puffed in little white clouds, a sharp contrast to the lifeless grey of her surroundings. The neighbourhood she was passing through was not one Claire would ever linger in willingly. Its cracked sidewalks, graffiti-tagged walls, and the faint scent of desperation were enough to hasten her step. She averted her eyes from the figures huddled in doorways, dirty blankets piled over them like shrouds. These people had no one to blame but themselves, she often thought. They should just try harder. The mere sight of them filled her with disdain. Ahead, a young black boy, no older than 12, caught her attention. He was sitting cross-legged on the sidewalk, his head bowed under a patched hoodie that barely covered his wiry frame. A makeshift sign lay propped up in front of him. Hungry. Any help is appreciated. Claire wrinkled her nose and walked on, her pace quickening. She didn't notice how the boy's dark eyes flicked up to her, a quiet longing in them. If she had, she might have dismissed it as another plea for pity. "Not my problem," she muttered under her breath, her gloved hands tightening around her bag. Claire turned a corner and was greeted by the screech of tires. A truck, swerving wildly, careened through the narrow street. Its brakes shrieked, but the vehicle didn't slow. It seemed to hurtle forward with a life of its own. Claire froze, panic locking her in place as the truck closed the gap between them. Time slowed. She saw the fear etched on the driver's face, heard the wail of onlookers. But her body wouldn't move. And then, like a shot of lightning, the boy was there. He moved with a speed and decisiveness that belied his small frame, tackling Claire out of the truck's path just as it roared past. They landed hard on the pavement, Claire's head smacking against the concrete. For a moment, the world blurred into spinning grey and white. When her vision cleared, she was lying on her back, staring into the boy's wide, concerned eyes. He looked even younger up close. His breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the cold morning air, and a scrape on his cheek oozed a thin line of blood. "Ma'am, are you okay?" His voice wavered, but his hands were steady as they hovered near her shoulders, not quite touching her. The crowd that had gathered watched in stunned silence, a stark contrast to the chaos moments earlier. Claire pushed herself up, her heart pounding. Her coat was torn, her hair dishevelled. "You," she started, the words coming out hoarse and strained. But before she could finish, the boy stood, brushing the dust from his threadbare jeans. "I'm sorry about your coat, ma'am," he said quietly. He looked at her with eyes far older than his years, eyes that held neither resentment nor expectation. "You're safe now." Claire blinked at him, speechless. The boy didn't wait for a response. He turned and began walking away, his steps unsteady but determined, disappearing back into the crowd as if he were nothing more than a shadow. Her chest tightened in a way she didn't understand. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't even wait for a thank you. And as she sat there on the cold pavement, Claire felt something unfamiliar crack through the armor she had built over years of prejudice and bitterness. But this story isn't about a miraculous transformation. Not yet. What Claire does next will leave you questioning the depths of the human soul. Claire sat in her car later that evening, the leather seat warm against her back, but unable to thaw the cold unease spreading through her. She hadn't returned to her office after the incident. Instead, She had driven aimlessly, replaying the moment over and over. The boy's eyes, the scrape on his cheek, his quiet dignity as he walked away. Why couldn't she stop thinking about him? She had done her best to forget the encounter. She had even told herself, "He's fine. He'll be just fine. People like him always bounce back." But the words felt hollow, even as she said them. A voice broke through her thoughts, her daughter's, years ago, as they passed a homeless man on the way to school. "Mom, why doesn't he have a home?" a young, curious voice had asked. "Because he didn't work hard enough," Claire had answered briskly. That memory stuck in her throat now like a shard of glass. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles whitening. Why did this boy matter so much? The next morning, Claire stood in front of the mirror, applying her makeup with quick, practiced strokes. Her reflection looked the same as it had every other day: crisp suit, perfect hair, and that steely, no-nonsense expression. Yet, she felt like a fraud. By the time she arrived at her office, the day's work barely registered. The numbers, emails, and client calls blurred into the background. Around noon, her assistant poked her head in. "Ms. Montgomery, are you feeling all right? You seem distracted." "I'm fine," Claire snapped, her tone harsher than intended. Her assistant retreated quickly, but Claire felt the guilt settle on her shoulders. She wasn't fine, and she knew why. By late afternoon, Claire found herself standing on the very sidewalk where the boy had saved her life. The streets were quieter now, the chill in the air biting harder. She walked slowly, scanning every corner, every shadow, her heels clicking against the pavement. When she saw him, her breath caught. He was sitting cross-legged in the same spot, his hoodie pulled tightly over his head. His sign rested beside him, but this time it lay flat, partially covered in dirt. The boy's head was bowed as though he were asleep, though Claire could see his fingers twitching slightly. She hesitated, torn between the instinct to turn away and the gnawing feeling in her chest that urged her forward. With shaky steps, she approached, her shadow falling over him. His head lifted slowly, his dark eyes meeting hers. Recognition flickered in his expression, followed by something else. Caution, perhaps. "Mum," he said quietly, his voice as steady as it had been the day before. Claire began, suddenly unsure why she was there. She had rehearsed this moment in her head during the drive over, but now the words seemed to tangle in her throat. Are you okay?" The boy blinked, surprised. "I'm fine. Are you hurt? From yesterday, I mean." "No, Mom," he said, his tone polite but distant. He pulled his hoodie tighter around himself, glancing away briefly. Claire swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Look, Thank you for asking," he interrupted gently. His words caught her off guard. "Thank you for asking." When was the last time someone had said that to her? I wanted to thank you for saving my life," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You're welcome," he replied simply, with a small nod. An awkward silence fell between them. Claire shifted her weight from one foot to the other, searching for something else to say. The boy didn't seem uncomfortable, though. He looked at her as though he had all the time in the world, as though she were the one who needed saving now. "What's your name?" she asked finally. "Jamal." "Jamal," she repeated, testing the name. It felt oddly personal, like a piece of him he had chosen to share. Do you have anyone? Family?" Jamal hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the frayed edge of his jeans. "My mum passed away a few years ago. It's just me now." The weight of his words struck Claire like a blow. She tried to imagine what life must be like for him. A boy, barely out of childhood, navigating the unforgiving streets alone. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He shrugged, offering a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. It's okay. I manage. But it wasn't okay, and Claire knew it. Her throat tightened as she looked at the boy, sitting there with nothing but a thin hoodie and a resolve that made her chest ache. How could someone so young carry so much weight and still have the strength to save a stranger? Impulsively, she reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet. "Here," she said, holding out a $50 bill. "It's not much, but—" "No, ma'am." Jamal's voice was firm as he shook his head. "What?" "I don't want your money," he said, his tone gentle but resolute. "I'm not a charity case." Claire froze, the bill still in her hand. She felt a flush of embarrassment rising in her cheeks. "I didn't mean it like that," she said quickly. "I know," Jamal said, his voice softening. "But I don't take handouts. That's not how my mom raised me." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Claire felt something crack deep inside her. Not resentment, not anger, but something harder to face. Shame. "I'll figure it out," Jamal added, his tone lighter now. "I always do." Claire stared at him, the 50 still clutched in her hand. She felt completely out of her depth, unsure what to do or say. But one thing was certain. Walking away from Jamal again didn't feel like an option anymore. That evening, Claire sat at her dining table, staring at the untouched plate of food in front of her. The soft glow of her chandelier cast long shadows across the room, its elegance feeling oddly hollow. Normally she would relish this time, an opportunity to unwind, a glass of red wine in hand. But tonight, her thoughts were consumed by Jamal. His face lingered in her mind, a mix of quiet strength and weariness that didn't belong on someone so young. His refusal to take her money baffled her. He had nothing. Why wouldn't he accept help? The question gnawed at her, pulling her deeper into reflection. She glanced around her dining room, her gaze landing on the crystal vases, the leather chairs, the sprawling Persian rug beneath her feet. All of it felt excessive, even grotesque, compared to the threadbare hoodie and worn sneakers Jamal wore as he braved the streets. For the first time in years, she felt the sharp pang of discomfort that came with realizing how insulated her life had become. The next morning, Claire drove through the city with purpose. The neighborhoods blurred past her, until she reached the street where she had first met Jamal. She parked nearby and began walking, her heels crunching against the pavement. It didn't take long to find him. Jamal was in the same spot, cross-legged on the sidewalk, though his posture looked more tired today. He wasn't holding his sign this time. It lay forgotten beside him, the edges curling from dampness. "Jamal," she called softly as she approached. His head lifted, his eyes widening briefly in recognition. Then his face settled into a neutral expression, as if bracing for whatever she had come to say. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice polite but cautious. Claire crouched slightly, leveling her gaze with his. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you did for me," she admitted. "I owe you my life, and I want to help you. Please let me help." Jamal's brow furrowed, his hands fidgeting with the frayed threads of his hoodie. "I don't need charity," he said firmly, though his voice lacked the conviction it held the day before. Claire bit her lip, considering her words carefully. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering kindness. Isn't that what you gave me yesterday?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, Jamal didn't respond. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the passing cars, his jaw tight. Finally, he sighed. "What do you want from me, Ma'am?" The question caught Claire off guard. She realized with a jolt that she hadn't thought this far ahead. She didn't have a plan, just an unshakable need to do something. "Nothing," she said softly. "I don't want anything from you. I just want to know what you need." Jamal's eyes flicked back to her, his expression guarded. "I've learned not to need anything. Needing things It just hurts more when you don't get them. The quiet confession hit Claire like a physical blow. She swallowed hard, her chest tightening. "Well," she said after a pause, her voice trembling slightly, "what if I told you I'm not going to let you down?" Jamal studied her for a long moment, as if trying to measure the weight of her words. Finally, he shrugged. "I need food sometimes," he said simply. "And a warm place to sleep. That's it." Claire nodded, her mind already racing. "I can help with that. I'll be back in an hour." Before Jamal could protest, she stood and walked briskly back to her car. Claire returned with a bag of food from a nearby diner, the smell of warm chicken soup and fresh bread wafting through the air. She handed it to Jamal, watching his expression carefully. He hesitated, his fingers brushing against the paper bag, before finally taking it. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire sat down on the edge of the sidewalk beside him, ignoring the odd looks from passers-by. "I want to know more about you," she said gently. Jamal glanced at her warily. "Why?" "Because you saved my life," Claire replied simply, "and because you matter." Her words seemed to catch Jamal off guard. He stared at her for a moment, then lowered his gaze. "There's not much to know," he said quietly. "My mum worked 2 jobs, but when she got sick, everything fell apart. We lost the apartment, and then she passed. I've been on my own since." The bluntness of his story made Claire's stomach churn. She wanted to say something, to offer words of comfort, but everything felt inadequate. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a blanket she had brought along. "Here," she said, unfolding it. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing." Jamal hesitated, then accepted it with a quiet, "Thank you." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they sat together in silence. For the first time, Claire felt a connection to someone outside her carefully constructed world. A connection that wasn't transactional or superficial, but raw and real. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she knew one thing. She couldn't abandon Jamal. Not now. The following week, Claire found herself driving to the city almost daily. Each time, she brought something new for Jamal, a warm coat, sturdy shoes, or a bag of groceries. At first he accepted her offerings hesitantly, his pride wrestling with his hunger and need for warmth. But slowly, he began to open up, and their conversations grew longer, more meaningful. Jamal told her about his mother, how she used to hum gospel songs while cooking, how her hugs could make the worst days bearable. He talked about school, which he'd left after her death, and how much he missed math, his favorite subject. "I always thought I'd be an engineer one day," he said one afternoon, his voice wistful. "Why can't you still be?" Claire asked. Jamal laughed dryly. "You need more than dreams to make it in this world, ma'am. You need money, connections. I don't have those things." Claire's heart clenched at his words. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. But she knew how hollow that sounded, coming from someone who had always had the privilege of opportunity. Instead, she said, "Maybe you don't have them yet, but I believe you could." Jamal didn't respond, but she noticed the way his lips quirked slightly, as though the idea of someone believing in him felt foreign but not unwelcome. Claire's visits didn't go unnoticed. One chilly afternoon, as she sat beside Jamal on the sidewalk, sharing coffee and sandwiches from a nearby cafe, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Well, isn't this cozy?" a woman sneered. Claire turned to see an older lady clutching a shopping bag, her lips pressed into a disapproving line. Claire stiffened. "Excuse me?" The woman gestured toward Jamal. "I've seen him here for months. He's always begging, always loitering, and now you're just encouraging him." Jamal looked down, his shoulders hunching. Claire felt a spark of anger flare in her chest. "He's not loitering," Claire said sharply. "He's a human being." the woman scoffed. Human being or not, people like him bring this neighborhood down. If you want to help, take him somewhere else. Claire's fists clenched, but before she could respond, Jamal spoke. His voice was calm but firm. It's okay, ma'am. She's right. I shouldn't be here. No, she's not right, Claire snapped, turning to him. You have every right to exist, Jamal. Don't ever let people like her make you feel otherwise. Jamal didn't respond, but the way he looked at her, a mix of gratitude and vulnerability, told her words had struck a chord. As the woman huffed and walked away, Claire felt her resolve harden. She wasn't just helping Jamal out of guilt or obligation anymore. She was helping him because she cared, because he deserved a chance at something better. But caring came with its own set of challenges. That evening, Claire sat at her kitchen table, the glow of her laptop illuminating her furrowed brow. She had spent hours researching shelters, community programs, and anything else that could offer Jamal a stable place to stay. Yet every option seemed to have a catch: limited beds, long wait lists, or requirements Jamal didn't meet. Frustration bubbled up inside her. She had never felt so helpless, so inadequate. Claire Montgomery wasn't used to hearing no, and the fact that she couldn't immediately fix this situation gnawed at her. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a text from her sister Meredith. You've been distant lately. Everything okay? Claire hesitated before replying. I'm fine, just busy with work. She couldn't bring herself to tell Meredith about Jamal. Her sister wouldn't understand. None of her friends or family would. They lived in a world where homelessness was a problem to be solved by policies and charities, not personal involvement. Claire herself had once believed that. But Jamal wasn't a problem. He was a person, a boy with dreams and a kind heart who had risked his life to save hers. And Claire was no longer content to sit on the sidelines while the world ignored him. The next morning, Claire picked Jamal up from the corner where he usually sat. She had decided it was time to take things a step further, even if she wasn't sure how he'd react. Where are we going? Jamal asked as he slid into her car, clutching the new backpack she had given him. You'll see, Claire said, trying to sound confident despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. They drove through the city until they reached a modest community center. Claire had called ahead and arranged for Jamal to meet with a caseworker who specialized in helping at-risk youth. Jamal, Claire began, turning to him as they parked. This is a place that can help you. They have people who can find you housing, help you finish school, whatever you need to get back on your feet. Jamal stared at the building, his expression unreadable. You think they care about people like me? He asked quietly. Yes, Claire said firmly. And if they don't, I'll make them. Jamal cracked a small smile at that, the first she'd seen in days. Okay, he said finally. Claire walked beside him as they entered the building, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. This was a step, a small one, but a step nonetheless. And as she watched Jamal shake the caseworker's hand, a thought struck her with startling clarity. Helping Jamal wasn't just about changing his life. It was about changing her own. Weeks passed, and Claire found herself spending more time at the community center than she had anticipated. She checked in on Jamal often, watching from a distance as he cautiously began to trust the caseworkers and participate in their programs. His transformation was slow but undeniable. One afternoon she arrived to find Jamal sitting in a corner of the study room, hunched over a notebook. The sight brought a smile to her face. Hey, Jamal, she said, walking over. He looked up, his expression brightening. Hi, Ms. Montgomery. What are you working on? Math, he said, tapping his pencil against the page. I'm trying to remember how to do these problems. It's been a while. Claire pulled up a chair beside him. Do you need help? Jamal hesitated, then slid the notebook toward her. As she explained the steps to solve the equation, she couldn't help but marvel at his focus. Despite everything he had been through, his determination burned brightly. "You've got this," she said, after he worked through a particularly tricky problem. Jamal grinned, his confidence growing with each solved equation. For the first time in a long time, he looked like a boy who believed in himself. Claire's involvement in Jamal's life didn't go unnoticed by her friends and family. One evening, as she hosted a small dinner party, her sister Meredith cornered her in the kitchen. "You've been different lately," Meredith said, watching as Claire stirred a pot of soup. "Different how?" Claire asked, though she already knew where this conversation was headed. "You're softer," Meredith said carefully. "More distracted too. Is something going on?" Claire hesitated, then decided to tell her the truth. "I've been helping someone, a boy named Jamal." Meredith raised an eyebrow. "Helping how?" "He's homeless," Claire said simply. "But he's smart, kind, and he deserves a chance." Meredith's eyes widened. "Claire, that's admirable, but are you sure this is a good idea? People like him—" "People like him," Claire snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. "I just mean, you don't know him. What if he takes advantage of you?" Claire's chest tightened with anger. "Jamal saved my life, Meredith. He didn't ask for anything in return. The least I can do is give him a chance." Meredith looked taken aback, but she didn't argue further. Still, the conversation left Claire unsettled. She realized how easy it had been for her and people like her to judge from a distance, to categorize others without truly understanding their struggles. But Claire knew Jamal. She knew his heart. And she wasn't about to let anyone reduce him to a stereotype. Months later, Jamal stood on the stage of a small auditorium at the community center, clutching a microphone in his hand. His clothes fit better now, his once gaunt face fuller and healthier. The room was filled with caseworkers, volunteers, and other young people who had benefited from the center's programs. Claire sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I never thought I'd be standing here," Jamal began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "For a long time, I thought the world didn't care about me. I thought I didn't matter. But someone showed me that I do." He glanced at Claire, and their eyes met. "This isn't just my story," he continued. "It's the story of everyone who's been told they're not good enough, that they don't belong. It's the story of people who fall and have to find a way to get back up." The audience erupted into applause as Jamal stepped back from the microphone. Claire stood too, clapping with a mixture of pride and joy that brought tears to her eyes. Later that evening, as Claire and Jamal walked to her car, he turned to her with a shy smile. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" Claire asked. "For believing in me. For not giving up on me." Claire felt her throat tighten. "You don't need to thank me, Jamal. You're the one who did the hard work. You're the one who never gave up." Jamal nodded, but his gaze was thoughtful. "I'm going to make it, Ms. Montgomery. I don't know how yet, but I'll find a way." "I know you will," Claire said firmly. As she watched him walk away that night, she realized something profound. Helping Jamal hadn't just changed his life, it had changed hers. She no longer saw the world through the narrow lens of her own privilege. She saw the resilience, the beauty, and the humanity in people she had once dismissed. Jamal had saved her life that day on the street, but in a way, he had saved her again by showing her what truly mattered.